Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of our look at part 1 of the Congress of Vienna by Historia Civilis. If you did not see my reaction to the first part of this video, there's a link in the description. It'll take you to that episode from yesterday, so you can get caught up, check that one out, and then come back to this one. I don't know how far we'll get. I'm guessing maybe another third of the way through this one. This is going to probably end up being a 3-part series just to get through the first part of theirs, because there's a lot to unpack here. We're going to still continuing to take a look at the background of each of the major players in this. Looks like we're looking at Russia next. I love how they're choosing to approach this. I love taking a look at each of these nations and seeing what's going on politically, what their aims are with the Congress of Vienna. So let's go ahead and dive into part 2.
When Castlereagh met Tsar Alexander of Russia for the first time, he wrote to his prime minister that he believed that the Russian monarch was not of sound mind. It's difficult to characterize Tsar Alexander, because it seems that most of his mental energy was caught up in creating narratives about what kind of person he was, and not so much in what he did or how he behaved. The thing that confused Castlereagh, and confuses me to be honest, is that Alexander had 8 or 10 of these narratives going through his head at the same time, and wasn't particularly bothered when they contradicted each other. Let me give you some specific examples. Alexander considered himself a true Enlightenment monarch, and told anybody who would listen that he believed in a limited constitutional monarchy.
Interesting.
And wanted Russia to have elections, and a parliament, and independent courts.
So there are quite a few of these Russian emperors who look to the West, and by the West I mean Britain, France, even Germany, things like that, and they see a lot of things that they like. And in some of these cases, these czars even go to the West as they're younger and they're preparing to rule, and they learn a lot, and they try to bring some of that back with them. But it also seems like a lot of these Russian leaders tend to be very disconnected from their people and what the needs are and what the struggles are, and they kind of always have one eye on the rest of the world and not really a lot to do with their people. So I don't know a lot about Alexander's background, so I'm interested to see how this plays out for him.
At the same time, he ruled Russia as a tyrannical dictator, which was justified in his mind because he believed that he was God's chosen instrument on Earth.
Not unique.
These two thoughts are not compatible, but Alexander did not see a contradiction. He would simply switch between these two modes of thought, depending on who he was talking to and how he felt that day. Here's another example.
So again, this is more about, I like what they're doing in the West. I see some good things, like the constitutional monarchy in the UK. But in his relations with his own people in real life, more despotic monarch.
Example. Alexander believed himself to be the most honorable man in Europe. A man who revered ritual and tradition and justice. Simultaneously, he believed that God made him emperor of Russia for a reason, and if he needed to go back on his word and use brute force to implement his will, that was all part of God's plan. These contradictory beliefs made Alexander impossible to deal with. His positions came off as utterly random, and they could change at any time, depending on his mood. He was unpredictable.
And that kind of goes along with the Russian foreign policy during the Napoleonic Wars. They kind of go back and forth a little bit. At one point they're kind of on Napoleon's side, at another point they're not, and end up drawing him back into war. And I'm oversimplifying that, but Russia was always kind of a wild card in all of this.
Predictable and unreliable and incomprehensible, particularly bad traits for a diplomat. So naturally, Alexander selected himself to represent Russia at the post-war peace conference.
Why trust someone else to do it?
As the most populous country in Europe, Russia was a formidable land power. But that inherent strength was undercut by weak institutions, weak governance, and the fact that Russia remained a technological backwater. This backwardness had always been a source of immense insecurity for Russian monarchs, but by 1814, all that insecurity was gone. Russia had just done the impossible and defeated Napoleon. At least...
Well, Russian weather defeated Napoleon. That's not to say Russia didn't have some good tactics. I mean, pulling out of Moscow and just basically letting him have it was a smart move.
In their own imagination, that's what happened. The truth is a little more complicated. Years of careful diplomacy had laid the groundwork for a coordinated attack against the French, and Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia was simply the catalyst. Had Napoleon been successful in Russia, the rest of Europe's great powers would have just waited for the next opportunity. But when the French started losing to Russia, most of Europe sprang into action. The plan was for every major European army to advance on Paris at a steady pace, but to pull back whenever opposed by the French army. The Allies knew that they couldn't defeat Napoleon on the battlefield, but with all of Europe's armies advancing as one, they wouldn't have to.
And this is why I always say when people ask me about how decisive was Waterloo, how important was that? Obviously, we're before Waterloo at this point, but and I say it wasn't because there were so many nations. This coalition against Napoleon was so overwhelming at this point that Napoleon was not going to win. Once he basically lost his army fighting against the Russians, he had no chance against this coalition. So it was important that they worked together, but I don't think it would have mattered in the end. Napoleon just could not win enough victories to win that war.
Napoleon couldn't be everywhere at once. Even if he won every possible battle, the Allies would still take Paris.
Yep.
The point is that no one country defeated Napoleon. Every country defeated Napoleon. But Tsar Alexander didn't see it like this. In his mind, it was all his doing. As part of their plan, the Allies had developed lists of key French towns to capture on the way to Paris. The Allied armies would need their logistical support, especially with several French armies coming up behind them. Tsar Alexander was personally in command of the Russian army, and once he was within spitting distance of French territory, he abandoned this plan and broke off from his allies and advanced on Paris.
He's like, ooh, Paris, something shiny, I'm going for it. Boy, there's nothing worse when you are in a multinational coalition and you've got an agreed upon plan. There's nothing worse than somebody throwing it all to the wind for personal glory. And that's what you have here. And it could have, if things hadn't been so overwhelmingly in favor of the coalition at this point, that kind of thing could have spelled disaster.
Alone. Alexander later said that this was a matter of personal honor. Never mind the commitment to his allies to all advance as one. Apparently, personal honor can only go so far. It was Tsar Alexander of Russia who took Paris, and it was Tsar Alexander who accepted Napoleon's surrender. Since Alexander placed himself in the center of the action, the fact that he liked to tell conflicting narratives about himself suddenly became very important to world history. On one hand, Alexander styled himself as the grand enemy of the French, as Napoleon finally meeting his match on the field of battle.
And let's just stop and take a moment and think about how interesting it is that in 1814 we have the Tsar of Russia styling himself as the enemy of the French, conquering Paris, saying that he was the one who took down Napoleon. And exactly 100 years later, we're going to have World War I, which starts in large part because of an alliance between Russia and France. Fascinating stuff.
On the other hand, Alexander still believed that he was the most honorable man in Europe. Spin the randomizer, and what do we get? Honor. Today, Alexander would treat Napoleon not as the enemy of Europe, but as his equal, the Emperor of Russia meeting with the Emperor of France. It was as equals that Alexander negotiated Napoleon's surrender.
And that's a good point to make, too, is that it's an interesting thing that when Napoleon is defeated in 1814 and he's deposed from France, he's forced to abdicate the French throne, he is still treated as an emperor. He's still viewed by the coalition as a head of state. And so when they exile him to a place where he's given authority and he's allowed to rule in that place that he is exiled to. He's allowed to have a personal guard. And so they give him a lot of the trappings of a head of state, even though he's been removed from France.
And as equals, Alexander gave Napoleon almost everything he wanted. Napoleon would be allowed to retain the title of emperor and would be permitted to remain an independent monarch until his death, ruling over the small island of Elba off the coast of Italy. He wouldn't be allowed to leave, but on the island, he would be a free man. The Allies were apoplectic. This was not what they...
If you ever hear that term apoplectic, apoplexy was a term that was used for this period of history to describe like a stroke or some major like bursting of a blood vessel or something that happens in your brain. So when you're saying apoplectic, basically you're saying their heads exploded.
They had agreed to. This put the British in particular in a terrible position because they had deliberately never recognized Napoleon as the legitimate emperor of France. Now, for some reason, the Russian Tsar was forcing them to legitimize Napoleon only in defeat. It was humiliating. When the rest of the Allies arrived in Paris, several of their leaders got up in Alexander's face and went ballistic. Alexander was in a different mood that day and gave them a placid response, saying that it was his duty as a Christian to forgive his enemies.
Interesting.
This is what made Alexander impossible to deal with. Today, he was saying that Napoleon had to remain an emperor for religious reasons. Yesterday, it was because of honor and tradition. Tomorrow, who knows? The Austrian foreign minister summarized these events in a report to his monarch, in which he called Alexander, and this is a real quote, the biggest baby on earth.
That's fantastic.
He continued, quote, "He has started out by doing a great deal of harm. We have repaired some of it, but we will suffer for some time as a result of those things he got up to in those first moments when he got away from us." Alexander's stated priorities going into the peace conference kinda depended on his mood, but it mostly had to do with the future of France. As previously discussed, the Allies had all agreed to restore the old Bourbon dynasty to the French throne. The problem was that Alexander didn't like the Bourbon kings. If you look at France's position in Europe, France had an interest in making sure that Central Europe remained fragmented and weak, and outside of the influence of any other great power.
Why? Because if Central Europe, specifically Germany, the old Holy Roman Empire, which of course comes to an end in this time period, keeping it fractured means that your influence remains strong because there's no equal force to oppose you, which is why when Germany forms a few decades later, it's such a big deal because now suddenly there is an equal or even stronger force to oppose the French.
To these ends, France had a long history of aligning itself with countries like Poland and Saxony and the Ottoman Empire. This was, of course, a geopolitical thing, but Tsar Alexander thought it was a personal thing, and that the Bourbon kings uniquely had a problem with Russia. Alexander's immediate priority was to keep the Bourbon Louis XVIII off of the French throne. He suggested making Napoleon's 4-year-old son the King of France, but Talleyrand patiently explained to him that this would allow Napoleon to pull the strings from exile. Alexander then tried to put a man named Bernadotte on the French throne. Bernadotte was a former French marshal who had turned against Napoleon and was single-handedly responsible for bringing Sweden into the coalition against France. In the late stages of the war...
Didn't Bernadotte become the King of Sweden? I need to look that up because I'm pretty sure that's what happened with him. Yeah, I thought so. In 1818, Marshal Bernadotte becomes King Charles XIV, I guess King Karl XIV of Sweden.
Bernadotte and Alexander had worked closely together, and Alexander viewed him as the one Frenchman he could trust. Alexander pushed hard for Bernadotte, but Talleyrand wouldn't budge. He and the Allies had all agreed on a Bourbon restoration, and they all saw Bernadotte for what he was, an attempt to put a Russian puppet on the French throne. Talleyrand explained to Alexander that they couldn't be placing whomever they wished on the French throne, or they were no better than the revolutionaries. The new king needed to be a legitimate French king of royal blood. Alexander got desperate. What about a distant cousin, a younger brother?
Anybody but
Louis
him.
XVIII. Talleyrand held firm, and Alexander backed down. An impressive.
This is where, for all of Talleyrand's faults that we talked about in yesterday's episode, and for all his wishy-washiness, in this moment, he's going to stand up to the Russian emperor and actually kind of win some points for the coalition against what
feat,
Alexander's
considering
after.
that the Russians had Paris under military occupation. A Bourbon king would return to the French throne, and Alexander's dream of a grand Franco-Russian alliance withered and died.
For now, Austria. Time for the Habsburgs.
I mentioned the Austrian foreign minister before, and how he had a rather dim opinion of the Russian Tsar. Biggest baby on earth, and all that. The Austrian foreign minister's name was Clemens von Metternich, and
it's important to remember, and he may mention this at some point, but Napoleon's wife, his second wife, was an Austrian princess. He had tried to make that alliance and also give some legitimacy to his own offspring by marrying into the Habsburg dynasty.
And the period we're beginning to cover today is sometimes called the Age of Metternich. That's a clue as to his importance. Metternich would become the architect of the post-war international system, and one of the 19th century's most preeminent figures. Metternich's task was vastly harder than it seemed, because not only was the international system undergoing a stark transformation at the time, but so was Austria. Of course, what I'm referencing here is the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire.
Huge.
And now my
1,000 years of
punishment
history
for bringing up the Holy Roman Empire is that I have to explain what it was. We should begin with the French philosopher Voltaire's famous quip that the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire.
Not entirely true.
So what was it? The Holy Roman Empire was a Central European institution that had existed in one form or another for over 1,000 years.
And here's the thing, and again, this goes to what is an empire? I mean, in the strictest definition of an empire, it's a multi-kingdom entity under an emperor, which is higher than a king. So, like Napoleon, he had an empire, and he had kings under him. There was a king of Italy, and there were these different kings, like he made family members kings in some of these places under one empire. That's the strictest definition. Of course, Rome doesn't have multiple kings, but it's still an empire. Honestly, though, you could loosely use the term empire to define any kind of coalition, like multi-ethnic, multinational organization that rules a bunch of separate, what otherwise could be considered countries. So from that standpoint, I would argue that the Holy Roman Empire is an empire. It just depends on how you look at it.
I say institution because the Holy Roman Empire was by no means a state. Each member of the empire conducted its own foreign policy, with its own military, under its own laws. Hundreds of tiny states were members of this club, this institution, and together they loosely supported a central emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor was a prestigious title with very little actual power behind it. He could call for aid if one of the member states was attacked, but it was up to each independent state whether or not they would respond. In fact, each state had its own unique deal worked out with the imperial crown, which put further limits on the emperor's power. Some were expected to contribute money to military campaigns, but no soldiers. Some were expected to contribute soldiers, but no money. Some were under no obligation to offer anything at all. By the 17th century, the Holy Roman Emperor could no longer even have an opinion on religious matters, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of the holy part of their title. Although the imperial crown was remarkably weak, The Holy Roman Emperor usually controlled the most powerful state within the empire.
Right.
Beginning in the 15th century and
Spain.
continuing up until the Napoleonic Wars. That meant that the Holy Roman Emperor was the Archduke of Austria. Since the 13th century, Austria had been controlled by the Habsburg family. The Habsburgs were one of the most powerful families in Europe, and at times over the last 500 years, they had controlled Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Germany, parts of northern Italy, Austria, Hungary, Croatia, Bohemia, I could go on. The dynasty was remarkably successful, and what made it especially remarkable is that very little of this territory was gained through conquest. It was instead gained diplomatically. The Austrian Habsburgs had a family motto: "Let others wage war, but thou, happy Austria, marry. For those kingdoms that Mars gives to others, Venus gives to thee."
And it's fascinating because that went contrary to how a lot of history had been dealt with. But this is wisdom, this is intelligence, this is understanding how things work. And it's the strategy I like to use when I'm playing Crusader Kings 3, is to marry into titles rather than having to conquer all of them. And it worked out well for them.
Others conquer through war. The Habsburgs conquer through marriage. Fast forward to the 19th century. The Holy Roman Emperor was still an Austrian Habsburg, now facing an expansionist France under Napoleon. He learned too late that the Holy Roman Empire was not equipped to face a direct attack. A victorious Napoleon demanded the abolition of the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, see, because some of these states within the Holy Roman Empire actually fought with Napoleon and had significant chunks of his army from them. So yeah, this is hardly one entity that's all united against Napoleon. Napoleon probably wouldn't have been as successful as he had been if the Holy Roman Emperor had been able to unite all of these states against him.
And the Habsburg Emperor, having decided that this powerless husk was no longer worth defending, agreed. With that, Austria became fully independent under its first emperor, Francis I. I lay all of that groundwork because by 1814, Austria was at a crossroads. The new Empire of Austria had played a critical role in the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. But now what? They could reform the Holy Roman Empire if they wished, but did they wish? When push came to shove, some of the largest members of the empire sided with Napoleon.
Right.
If the Holy Roman Empire wasn't a military alliance, what good was it? Yes, the title was prestigious, but you could argue that the restrictions within the empire only slowed Austria down, with no clear benefit. Francis, the former Holy Roman Emperor, and the current Austrian Emperor, was sympathetic to this point of view, as was his foreign minister, Metternich. Metternich is sometimes described as a conservative or a reactionary, but that's not quite right. A true reactionary would have fought to reform the Holy Roman Empire, but Metternich happily allowed it to die. He was a realist, not that concerned with ideology, so long as it protected his hard-won peace. In his excellent and definitive biography of Metternich, Wolfram Zeeman writes that, quote, "This, the question of whether Metternich was a reactionary, disregards the experiences of human beings who were looking back at 25 years of war and revolution. The question contemporary witnesses asked themselves was whether the more than 3 million dead on the battlefields of Europe had died for any meaningful goal. In many peasant families, there were no male youths left."
I just want to stop and just make an observation in general about Historia Civilis as a channel. Their work on this stuff is fantastic. It's not necessarily the most visually appealing among channels. There are a lot of channels that might look really slick, like oversimplified with their great animation and that kind of stuff like that. But man, the information is top notch on this channel and on their videos, and they've really done a great job of laying this all out in such a way that it makes sense. And again, I've said it a couple times now, but I love their approach by spending a significant amount of time showing each of these major players and what they have at stake and what their background is and what they're after in all of this.
That 3 million number is on the lower end of the spectrum. I've seen credible estimates of 5 to 7 million when you include civilians.
Yeah.
Unthinkable loss. Nobody who lived through this period would ever be the same. Across France, 20% of the men born between 1790 and 1795 were dead. An entire generation of young men had been wiped out.
That's true. We're going to stop right there. There's about 13 minutes left in that video, so we've gotten through about the second third of it. I think that's probably a good stopping point. I don't know what's coming next, so I don't know if it's a good stopping point, but that's where we're going to stop. If you like what you see and you want to see more, please hit that like button. Please subscribe if you're new and you want to see more. And don't forget to turn on those notifications. So every time a new video goes up on the channel, you'll get a notification so you'll know right away so you can check it out. Tomorrow, we'll be back with part 3 as well as episode 2 of my series from the Antietam battlefield. It's the story of the 12th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. So be watching for that as well. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.